She is a best-selling author, writer for The Ringer, and she is joining us today on the Victory Degree podcast. Mirin Fader, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, Mirin, your first work was Giannis, exploring the life and the story and the upbringing of obviously Giannis Antetokounmpo. For those who haven't read it, highly recommend. Your newest work is exploring the life and legacy of Hakeem Olajuwon. Newest book is coming out at the time of this recording. It's coming out tomorrow, so Tuesday, October 15th. Pick it up wherever you buy books. We were just joking around. I read it in a couple days because it was so good. Couldn't put it down. So highly recommend. And so when you think about Hakeem and all the, stuff you had to do, all the research you had to do in preparing this book, I heard you went on the Ryan Russillo podcast and you had told Ryan that you wanted to write this book because you felt like Hakeem was underappreciated and underrated both as a player and as a person. I'm curious, what did you learn about Hakeem that surprised you in your research?
Yeah, I think just as you and I talked about, we're both pretty young, so this was not our era. And I think, I loosely knew his story, but I didn't know how incredibly not just dominant he was, but also just what an impact he made on so many different communities. It's like picture LeBron James today going to a church in LA and just getting to know the kids there. Like that was what Hakeem did all throughout Houston. So, I really just it was surprising to me what a global superstar he was, and yet what a normal, humble man of the people that he was. It's really cool.
Yeah, so we'll get into some of the details because I, to your point, there's a lot that I learned about Hakeem as a person, but not even just as a person, but as an NBA player. You just mentioned it. I'm pretty decently young, 27. So, by the time that Hakeem was in his prime, and then even as he was leaving the NBA, I had just picked up the NBA and started watching basketball. And so my memories of Hakeem as a player are very, very limited. And perhaps other people who are listening to this podcast, maybe they don't even fully understand who he was as a player. So if you had to pick a combination of players or maybe one specific player that you could compare Hakeem to, present NBA, who would that be?
I know this sounds very like, of course she would say this, but the only person I see is Giannis.
Mm.
Um, but Hakeem could really hit that elbow shot really consistently and the soft touch. Like they are different players for sure. But I just see so much of Hakeem in Giannis. Hakeem is like one of those players that I absolutely think could dominate today's era. He's built for it. He inspired it. I think that's really what I wanted to show in the book, that, he was positionless basketball before positionless basketball. He was the creative, the fluid, the, multifaceted player that they want big men to be these days. The idea of like a back to the basket center now is like laughable. And yet Hakeem was just destroying all of those centers because they were slow and he was quick. So I think, there's so many parts of his game that you see in the players that came to him. Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, like the agility, the quickness, all these guards and forwards, like they share so much of what made Dream so good.
So let's stick on that topic just a little bit because as you just mentioned, Kobe, LeBron, other players came to Hakeem. What were they looking to learn from him?
They needed to go down to the post, but really they needed to expand their game and just become more multifaceted. So, because Hakeem has a counter for every counter. So, if somebody doesn't fall for the first up fake, they are definitely falling for the second up fake or the up and under or turning left, turning right. It's very instinctual. It's ballet like. And so, Kobe, he was like, I need to go down into the post more. Like all that we would see, especially me being in LA, when Kobe would back somebody down and you see the little shoulder shake and turn around, like that was Dream. LeBron, like, the book starts with, the failure of the Heat in the finals. And it was just kind of exposed, like, he can't go inside. And so he needed that grounding to expand his game. But really, it's interesting. Like even people like Steve Francis, who, would end up playing with Olajuwon, like they idolized him. Guards idolized this center who is almost 7 feet. And that is because he had the quickness of a guard. He thought like a guard. He played like a guard. And I think the game just translated to so many of the younger generations.
Yeah, and we'll get more to his game later on. But I figure this might be a good place to go back in time and go back to Hakeem's upbringing, because I think there's a lot of details in there that really influence both him as a player and then as a person, and some of the same themes kind of keep popping up throughout his entire life. So in order to understand who Hakeem was, as a University of Houston basketball player and then later a Houston Rocket, I think we need to understand who Hakeem was in Nigeria. So let's go back to 1963. And if you could kind of set the stage for what basketball was like in Nigeria and just the country as a whole, what kind of situation Hakeem grew up in.
Yeah, so he grew up in Lagos. It was a really cosmopolitan big city. English is the national language. Lagos, like it is today, very known for its culture, music, fashion, food, like a very vibrant place. There was this music festival that I, talked about there. He lived near the recording artist slash activist Fela. Like it was a very cool time to be in Lagos. But basketball was not really that huge. So a lot of the countries that were under British colonization originally, like Nigeria, they didn't start playing basketball until 1960s. A lot of the other places had a better start. So Egypt was in already in Olympic basketball in the 1930s. So Nigeria was pretty far behind. But the players that did play also were in the actual army of Nigeria. So Hakeem is not just playing against like random, he's playing against like grown men that are very physical and very strong, very talented. And so that's who he was going up against. There is a really, really amazing player that he gets to know named Yomi Sangodeyi, who is like, and he became a FIBA Hall of Famer, Nigerian legend. He played overseas for more than a decade. And that was who Hakeem really modeled his game after.
Yeah, it was interesting reading about the state of basketball in Nigeria, and I had this thought pop up, and it's always fascinating as I interview athletes or as I learn more about athletes. A lot of the things that had to go right for a certain athlete to get to where they are. I don't know if you've seen the statistics where it's like, and I'm going to butcher this, but it's like 15% of football players, make it to the college level. And then out of those 15%, 5% get drafted, and then 2% stay beyond their first 3-year or 4-year contract. So just the odds of making it in any professional sport is astronomical. And so when I think of Hakeem's journey, he grew up in a country where, to your point, basketball was not a big thing, right? It was mostly a European, American, and even European to a lesser extent, definitely more prevalent in the United States. And so how do you think that impacts his journey? Like if he had grown up hypothetically in a France or in England or even the United States, do you see his journey playing out the same way?
It's interesting to think about, right? Like if he was in Europe, like I mean, I bet you he would have found basketball earlier just because he's so tall. But he also loved to play like, what we call soccer, football. And so I can see him actually taking that sport on more seriously if he was in, Europe or grew up elsewhere. But I don't know. It's hard because that conception, even if you were in Europe of like, one day I'm going to go play in the NBA, that didn't exist. It just wasn't a thing. The international basketball explosion as we know it today, all of those European players that would come, in the late 90s, 2000s, they were really inspired by Hakeem. So he was kind of the trailblazer in that regard. It just wasn't a conception as it is today where, you grow up around the world and you think about the NBA, you watch the NBA. The teammates that Hakeem had in Nigeria, they were well aware of the NBA. They watched it. They knew who people like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was, Moses Malone, but it just wasn't this thing where you get scouted and there's academies and there's camps. So Hakeem's ascension is almost like by accident, which is unbelievable and really speaks to his natural talent.
Yeah, well, and part of that ascension is he initially was really into handball. Besides
Yeah.
soccer, he also loved handball, which for those, it's a lot less popular, I'd say in North America. But for those familiar with handball, it's a game that requires a lot of agility. It's very fast paced. It takes a lot of skill to play, and Hakeem was really great at it. And there was a point in from your book where he was playing both sports and trying to balance between the two. So what was that situation?
What was hysterical, like he would go on this like cart, almost like a car, between the handball tournament and the basketball tournament because he didn't want to let each team down, so he would have to leave early and go to the other game. These basketball coaches in the area who I spoke to, who are now in their 80s, they were like, we just it took us forever to get him to commit just to basketball. Even when he tried out basketball, he's like, I'm not letting handball alone. Like, I'm not letting, football alone. So he was just doing all these sports at once. And even so, his parents were like, focus on your studies. Like, sports was an afterthought. Sports were like, back then, it was considered like unserious. Like, you have to study. The goal was to go to university abroad, get an education. So the fact that he was playing all these sports wasn't something that had him on track of like, wow, look at this, you're about to play sports in America. That just wasn't the conception. It was like, okay, you can reward yourself by playing sports after you finish your homework.
I'm
Speaking of
not
his
mad at
parents,
it.
yeah. I mean, listen, fair point. My parents were the same way. They're like, you can go and do what you want as long as you get, straight A's. We're good with what you want to do outside of school.
That's right.
But I think so speaking of his parents obviously play a huge role in Hakeem's upbringing. And specifically, I want to take us to the role of religion, especially early on in Hakeem's upbringing. And we'll see as we start to talk about Hakeem, he has these ebbs and flows with Islam. He's Muslim growing up, and then as he got to the United States, kind of fell out with the religion, and then we'll kind of see what happens at the end. But growing up, just the role of his parents, of religion, and what that upbringing was like.
Yeah, his parents were incredibly faithful. He has these early memories of just watching his mom pray, doing the first of five prayers at, crack of dawn, and just like really admiring her dedication. Like, wow, somebody wakes up that early and pray. It's like a child trying to understand. And his parents, they taught him the fundamental values of Islam, whether it's like giving to others, charity, or selflessness. He was very much raised like in the culture of being a Muslim. Like he loved the call to prayer that would play throughout the city. It was a very beautiful melody to him. So, his parents who both made their Hajj to Mecca were such an example of, what it means to really be faithful and to, hold truth to those values. And they wanted all of their kids to be like that as well.
And that's where some of the, we talk about education and some of the values that they instilled in him. A lot of the values that Hakeem had later on throughout his NBA career were tied back to religion and then his parents.
Right. Yeah, and it's so interesting because he abandons that faith, as you alluded to, for over a decade. And when he finally does want to return to it, when he's in a really dark place, both in his career and personally, and everything that was going on in his life, he thought back to his parents. He thought back to the example that they set for him, just what it meant to them. And I think that's so important. Like I think his parents taught him so much about discipline, about respect, giving to other people, and he never forgot that.
Yeah. One fact that I think can't go unsaid is the fact that he picked up basketball at the age of 16.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
I
Nuts.
mean, crazy. And I've heard there are other examples, like I think Joel Embiid similarly picked up basketball. I think it was 15, 16.
Right.
So there are other examples, certainly not the norm, but
Right.
Hakeem was able to do it. And then, if I'm not mistaken, he made the national team 4 months later. So
Yes.
can you help for the audience, because it's absolutely insane. Just set the timeline
Right.
of his basketball from the time of him picking up a basketball to, let's say, by the time he gets recruited to the University of Houston. Can we just expand that timeline a little bit?
Yeah, it really is only a matter of about 4 months, like you said, beginning in 1979. And not only does he pick up a ball and he's not a natural at age 17, literally one of his teammates said to me he couldn't dribble, he couldn't do anything. There was definitely this sense of like, okay, we need this guy on our team. He's so tall. He definitely doesn't know what he's doing, but look at, he can block shots, he can play defense. And so they were just in awe of him. He was the tallest person in the neighborhood. So in a 4 month span, he literally learns the rules of basketball. Like you can't travel, here's this line, here's that line. He literally learns the game, but he is so feisty and so into it that he's even, 2 months in questioning why the refs aren't calling fouls for him, which I thought was hysterical. And he's barely like a fish out of water. He makes the national team more so out of the coaches want him to get that experience. He didn't end up playing a whole lot. It was at a tournament in Morocco in 1980, but he needed to go to see what it was like to compete at that level. And he did get to go in. And even though he wasn't, in love with how he played, it was a really, really big moment for him. And the coach of that team, he's known as Coach OBJ. He's like the godfather of Nigerian basketball, Oliver B. Johnson. Coach OBJ would eventually coach Masai Ujiri. And so of the Raptors. So there is this timeline between this coach who helped Masai and Olajuwon. And you can see he's just such an incredible coach. He's coached so many people. There's no way that Olajuwon improves that much without that coaching. And it wasn't just him. He had multiple coaches that were on his tail, making sure he stopped playing handball and focused on basketball, teaching him the drop step every day. So, he gets better because he has this group of people that wants to help him. And one of his former teammates said, we all looked at it like, if one of us makes it, we all make it.
Right. It's always interesting in, thinking about some of these stories where there always seems to be one or two people who are instrumental, above and beyond everybody else. Like you can always point to someone's journey and say, this specific person or these two specific people really propelled them to the next level. And that was Coach OBJ for Hakeem.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you said that because that was really a goal for me in so many different parts of the book, whether it's talking about the mentorship of Moses Malone or the player I mentioned earlier, Yomi Sangodei, or Carol Dawson, the former Rockets GM and assistant coach, Rudy Tomjanovich. Like there was a community of people that helped him and made him better. Maybe that's why I like profiling international players and writing about international stars. There's something so different from the way it is in America of this like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and, you're the one that makes it. And I was grinding myself. And it's just a whole lot of I. And, when I talk to these international players and the people that play with them, community is like always the biggest theme, always.
That's really interesting because I see it in business too, or like entrepreneurship. Like it is celebrated to be the one person who did it all, or to say, I built this by myself.
Right.
Or podcasting I feel like is, exhibit A, where it's like person A built this podcast to this, to this large of an audience or whatever. To your point, it's celebrated a lot, but we often forget about the people who helped us along the way. And those people are usually way more important and have contributed way more than maybe we did as individuals.
Oh my God, like the thought of publishing a story or a book without an editor just gives me like I had like a mini like heart palpitation thinking about it. Like the amount of people that helped. Oh my God, like I have so many mentors and so many people and I don't know, maybe it's because I played sports and I had so many coaches, but yeah, I hate the me like thing we see in a lot of, because like literally nobody makes it alone.
Right.
And you have to have talent and you have to have drive, but people have to help you. Like there's no way that Hakeem starts playing basketball at age 17 and then leads the country in block shots 2 years later without help. Like that just doesn't happen.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of help, one of the reasons Hakeem is often referred to as, the dream is the way that he got to the University of Houston. And it is, for whatever reason, a highly controversial story, and there's many different angles. And still to this day, correct me if I'm wrong, there's still stuff coming out that contradicts other stories, and we still don't necessarily know exactly what happened. So for those unaware, and I certainly was one of those people who was unaware of that story before reading your book, can you give us just a brief overview of how it happened, how Hakeem actually got to America and the University of Houston, and then why it's so controversial?
Yeah, so the name Dream really is fitting, not just because of like the dream player he is on the court, but there is this kind of like fairy tale mythological aspect, and a lot of that has to do with how he got to America. So the tale, as I call it, begins. There happened to be this coach, Chris Pond. He's an American, he's a white guy. He happened to be in the Central African Republic coaching. We don't know how, we don't know what, but he was there. Then he sees Hakeem. Wow, you're so good. You can play in America. Next day, goes to the embassy, gets him a visa. Boom, he's landed at JFK in New York. Hakeem is cold. I can't play in New York. It's too cold. Oh my God, I got to shiver. I got to go to the University of Houston, which is where I was supposed to visit next. And then by the grace of weather, he then joins the Cougars, and then they become a powerhouse. And then he stays in Houston for the rest of his NBA career. And it's a lovely, lovely, lovely story. But there's so much more truth that I found in my reporting. First of all, Chris Pond, while he did coach in the Central African Republic and Liberia and a couple of other places, he did not work for the State Department, as a lot of the early articles said that were written at the time of Olajuwon's rise. And, Coach Pond said that he had all these visits lined up for Hakeem, including St. John's. And so every year there's always an article like, St. John's missed out on Olajuwon. He was supposed to go there. But, I contacted the coaches at that time, and they said, no, we never recruited Olajuwon. There was no visit plan. There was no contact with Chris Pond. It's not true. And it's basically just a myth that has been perpetuated through the years. I talked with all the other surviving coaches of the other schools on the supposed list. And even though Hakeem did have plane tickets to go to those places, those coaches, again, they were like, we had no contact with this guy, Chris Pond. So, we never recruited Olajuwon. So, in all my reporting and all the work I did on this, I think the plan was to go to Houston all along. Chris Pond somehow knew Guy Lewis, but again, Guy Lewis is the coach of Houston. Nobody really knows like how they know each other. Even Guy Lewis's son, who's his only surviving child right now, he was like, I don't even know how my dad knew that guy. So essentially, there's just a lot of myth. It's a great story, but I think the plan was to go to Houston.
Yeah, and it was interesting reading about how Hakeem had preferred Houston because of the weather and how it reminded him of back home. Kind of funny how life works out sometimes.
Right. I'm glad it worked. I mean, amazing. I love this. I love the fact that he stayed, and it was a perfect place. Really, really great. But it was weird to me as a journalist that like nobody interrogated this for like the last 4 or 5 decades. Even at the time, I talked to a lot of beat writers from that time. They're like, yeah, everyone sort of loved that there was this clumsiness to it all, this mystique, and nobody really tried to look into it.
Yeah, that's interesting. That was gonna be my next question. Is like, why do you think there's so much? Why the story is the way it is with just not being able to know exactly what happened. I mean, I guess I understand maybe there's a certain mystique around it, and Hakeem, ended up being a fantastic player and all worked out. But to your point, I feel like sometimes we should probably know the truth.
First of all, Chris Pond has passed away, so we only have his accounts from, that era and what was reported on. I think also Hakeem only went off of what Chris Pond told him, and he had his plane tickets to all these different places, and Pond said, yeah, I have scheduled visits for you at all these places. So he's only repeating information that he was told, so even though these visits were not actually really on the schedule on these universities, it just got passed down. It's like telephone, you pass it down. And, I think Olajuwon like unknowingly perpetuated this myth that obviously he didn't know was not true, because the coach said, hey, I've got a ticket for you here and I've got a visit there. So I think over the years, it's just kind of been one of those stories that has never fully been solved. So it was really important to me to get to the bottom of that. Because, sports, like, we love our origin stories. We love knowing how they got here, where they came from, what made them into who they are. That's a huge part of the story.
So somehow Hakeem gets to the University of Houston.
Right.
he plays at the University of Houston from 81 to 84. And before we maybe get into what that was like from a basketball perspective, again, I really want to set the stage for the audience and set the backdrop of the environment that Hakeem is playing in. I want to pull up a quote from your book, and this is from a media member from Houston who said, Olajuwon is a 7-foot modern day Goliath who swats basketballs away like he would flies in his native Lagos, Nigeria. Can you touch upon just what the media's portrayal of Olajuwon was, and then just playing in Houston, playing in the Deep South at the time, especially, you know, for a man like Hakeem Olajuwon, you know, comes from Africa. What was that like for him?
Yeah, I mean that was one of the most egregious examples I saw in the archives of just flat out racism. You know, a lot of people were very ignorant about Africa just in general, let alone Nigeria. And so, you know, it really frustrated him that people had no idea that he came from, you know, a big city. He spoke English. Everyone spoke English. People treated him like an outsider. They always asked if he was, quote, from the jungle. He even penned one article in the student newspaper about how people think he's, quote, dumb or doesn't know what's going on. There was a lot of racism. At the same time, there were some media members that really did treat him with decency and respect. And one of them is a pioneering Black journalist, Ralph Cooper, who is just such an awesome interview. And he had been to Africa. So the two of them had quite a great bond. But for the most part, it was just a lot of questions that were uneducated, ignorant. I think people were trying to be very clever. They thought they were clever, but it was just racist in the writing. You know, they would try to do alliteration and rhyme, and you know, make all these metaphors. But it's really sad, and it was important for me to touch on this part because I think his time again at Houston, while it was amazing and those teams were incredible, and Phi Slama Jama was unstoppable and great, and you know, he had the time of his life and met some of his best friends, there was this element of ignorance and racism that he did face, and I thought it was really important to show that side, this sort of unmythologized version of his story.
How much do you think that affected Hakeem?
I think it bothered him for sure. I mean, in that article, I mentioned that he wrote for the student newspaper. He mentioned that, you know, it frustrated him, and he talked about in various stories for Sports Illustrated at the time that it really just bothered him how people didn't get it. And a lot of his teammates spoke to me about how he was shocked at how ignorant people were in America, you know, just very shocked at first at how little they knew about Africa. So I think that was really hard. There was no culture shock in terms of like adjusting to America. The only shock was just that people knew so little about where he came from.
Right. When we get to Hakeem's basketball experience at Houston, it starts off with kind of in a funny way. His head coach didn't think he knew how to play basketball, or at least was very unimpressed with Hakeem's ability on the court. But throughout the years, Hakeem seems to figure it out and pick it up. So when you look at Hakeem's overall experience at the University of Houston, are there a couple moments or experiences that stand out to you?
I think it was the summers at Fondy Rec Center, you know, when he played against Moses Malone and a lot of the Rockets. That is how he made such leaps in his game. It was just every single day having to compete against those guys. You go from like not really knowing the rules of the game to going against Moses Malone, like you're gonna get better. And that's why I think his growth was just so rapid. It was those games. I mean, it's like, you know, for us out here in LA, like the Drew League, it was like that before that was a thing, and everyone came to those games. And so I think he's such a competitor. He thrived in that environment because he would always get up for games. Like he loved that. So I think that really stands out to me. I think the losses that he went through each year with the Cougars, you know, they went to the Final Four and they kept coming up short. I really think that motivated him for so many years in the NBA because it took him a very, very, very long time to win his first NBA title. And so I think the seeds of that, I want to prove that I can win, I want to be a winner, started in college.
So you mentioned Moses Malone, and we alluded to him earlier as one of those people that really made an impact on Hakeem's journey. Can you expand a little bit on what Moses' impact was on Hakeem?
Yeah, Moses, I mean, the way that former NBA players describe him to me is just one of the most generous souls. I mean, up until his death, he was very active in the Alumni Players Association, the NBA, and he worked on behalf of so many players to get them media opportunities, charity events, stuff like that. And so when he meets Hakeem in college, this like really scrawny, tall kid that's got potential, but really doesn't know what he's doing, he just takes him under his wing. And what I loved is it wasn't even so much, taking him to the side and giving him, verbal lessons. It really was just one on one every single day. They would always guard each other. But then they got close, and Moses would take him to a place called Frenchie's and they would hang out. And he was like the cool star that, had him in his Maserati. And it was just really awesome. He would give Hakeem hand-me-down clothes. So people would see Hakeem in these really nice sweatsuits and be like, where'd you get that? And he's like, Moses gave it to me. So imagine Moses Malone is like your best friend. That's so cool.
Yeah, definitely jealous. Another aspect of all of this, as we kind of wrap up Hakeem's experience at the University of Houston, is just the relationship between college basketball and international players at a time where it seemed like international players weren't widely accepted, or at least there was a certain stigma around them. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, this was so important for me to track during the book to show how much, Olajuwon really would inspire generations of international players because he really was one of the first. God, speaking of that Goliath quote that you said, there was definitely some awful articles written about just international players in general that I put in the book, and just the stigma that they didn't know what they were doing or they weren't quote skilled, they didn't have quote fundamentals, they were quote raw, just even some of the racist, sort of coded language that we see today. Um, Basketball from Africa, like Hakeem was one of the first. That was not a really common thing. And so people almost just didn't really know what to do with it. But as he's really starting to excel in the college game, all these coaches are like, well, how do we get somebody like Hakeem? So, I talked to assistant coaches at the time who started making trips over to Africa and started charting how, this was like the pivotal moment where college basketball changed and recruiters started to look beyond, their area or the US. They were like, oh, like how did Guy Lewis get this guy? We got to make a trip. We got to expand our pool. Now that's normal. I mean, you look on a college team, there's teams with like 5, 6 international players, but that was just not the case back then.
Yeah. Oh, I just remembered you mentioned Phi Slama Jama. And for those who might not be familiar with the term, what was Phi Slama Jama?
God, how do I just see
Where
people
do you start?
I just see people dunking after one or the other. Yeah, so Phi Slama Jama was the name of Texas's tallest fraternity, what this Cougars team was called because they were just so athletic and they'd jump over you and dunk over you. And it was so cool. Like there's just the image I have is Clyde Drexler just like dunking over somebody. They were just the most exciting college basketball team. And this is an era where, East Coast basketball is really huge. It's about Georgetown, it's about Villanova, a lot of prestigious places like that. And here comes Houston, running and gunning and putting on a show. It was like the Fab Five before the Fab Five.
Yeah, I went back and I think there's an ESPN 30 for 30 on it.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd highly recommend if you're interested. It was a great documentary. Yeah, I think it's important, as we study the life of Hakeem, and obviously as you put it so well in your book, we often forget, and I'm certainly guilty of this, where we look at players and we strictly view them as just basketball players. And we strictly judge them based off their performance on the court without really taking into account the larger picture, which is why I always go back to this idea of what kind of environment was Hakeem operating in? Because I think with Hakeem's story, you gain even more appreciation for what he was able to do on the court when you put that up against the backdrop of what was happening around him. And so that's why, whether growing up in Nigeria or playing basketball in the deep South at a time where, you know, basically black, players weren't as accepted, and there was definitely a lot of racism that Hakeem had to deal with, and didn't also help that he was from Nigeria, and he was an international player. And so when you take into account the totality of the situation, it makes Hakeem even that more impressive.
Yeah, and then when you add, back the religion aspect of, him reclaiming that faith, that he doesn't, I don't think he achieves what he eventually achieves as far as the two-time NBA champion without that. So, for me, I just think it's so weird to not think about somebody's story and their environment and the adversity and things that they've gone through off the floor, because everything you go through off the floor affects everything on the floor, always.
Right. So let's get to Hakeem's NBA journey, which starts with the 1984 NBA draft. Um, Widely considered one of the best drafts of all time. But before any players were picked, there was a coin flip that happened. And so I was hoping you could set the stage for the 84 draft and why Hakeem went to the Rockets, why Jordan went to the Bulls, kind of how that entire scenario played out.
Well, isn't it funny they had a coin flip? Like I can't get over it. I'm just
That,
imagining like these old guys around the table and just,
right.
watching this millisecond moment happen. But yeah, so after this draft, that there would be no more coin flip and it would
Thank
turn
God.
into, yeah, the lottery that we have. Although I gotta say the coin flip on social media would be hysterical. I could just see the conspiracy. That's not a
Oh,
real quarter. Like I could just see them coming out in force. Um, but yeah, so at first it wasn't clear who would get the number one pick. It might have been the Bulls. Blazers were involved. The Rockets and Houston ended up getting the number one pick. And there was this unanimous sense that Olajuwon would be number one because even though Jordan, was obviously doing so well in North Carolina, like the way people did not think Jordan would be Jordan. And I spoke with the Bulls personnel and they were like, we thought he was really, really good. But even when we picked him, we were like, somebody said to us, I hope he pans out. So and there was also this sense back then that you couldn't win with a guard. There wasn't this sense of like, yeah, let me just draft this up and coming guard. You had to win with a center. And because Houston already had Ralph Sampson, who was 7'4", this idea of like him and Olajuwon together was something people had, never seen. There have been various versions of Twin Towers, like very tall centers on the same team, but this just felt different because of how tall and how unique they were, how they moved so differently. They both were kind of positionless. And so even though the Bulls people told me, they're like, yeah, if we had the number one pick, we would have picked Olajuwon. I just think it says so much about Olajuwon that to this day, people aren't saying that the Rockets should have taken Jordan. Like that's huge.
Yeah, and I still can't get over how different how different the NBA was back then. You mentioned it with you can't win without a center. Now it's like you can't win without a guard. I mean,
Right.
you could fill in person X in the center position. You can get by. I mean, I think to the Warriors, with Looney, who again, with all due respect, he's a good player, but he's no he's no all-star.
Yeah.
Um, and so when I look at how modern teams are constructed, I think actually probably the closest that we've come to a true Twin Towers is maybe Cat and Gobert with the
Mhm.
Timberwolves. But
Mhm.
even that, I mean, Cat is a different play. He's not a prototypical center. I mean, he can hit a three. He's mobile. But Samson and Olajuwon, that seemed like a home run for the Rockets.
Yeah. And it was so interesting because like Ralph Sampson, who would have a lot of injuries, he I think really got an unfair rap at the time because of all the way that we've been talking about how basketball has changed. Ralph was so ahead of his time. He wanted to be a guard, he wanted to be on the perimeter, and so he was almost punished for not, being that traditional big man. When you're 7'4" and you're not dunking every single thing inside, they're just like, well, you're a waste of size. The way people talked about him was very dehumanizing like that. So I think he was a great teammate for Olajuwon, but unfortunately together they didn't quite reach their potential because of injuries. There was drug problems. There were so many factors where you thought the Rockets were going to be this young dynasty, but it just fizzled out.
Well, and then let's not forget that Samson was the number one pick the year prior. right? So the
Right.
Rockets had two number one picks back to back years.
Right. And that is why the coin flip is gone because people think that I think it's widely accepted that the Rockets tanked to get back to back, but that was something, as a journalist, you can't literally prove that people intentionally tanked. That it is very hard to, definitively say, but that is a widely held belief and why, it moved more towards the lottery system.
So Olajuwon gets picked number one by the Rockets. Jordan goes number three to the Bulls. And they both start their. And let's not forget, Barkley was also in that draft.
Right,
Can't
right,
forget about my man Charles Barkley. We just had Timothy Bell
right.
on. We were talking right before this. By the way, Tim's book on Barkley is fantastic. Also, highly recommend that read. But it was funny because I think you said in your book you have a quote that said, I forget who it was. Maybe it was the Trailblazers who said that they didn't want to pick Barkley because they thought he was undersized, or some
Oh
team
yeah,
had said,
Rod Thorne. He was with the
yeah,
Bulls. He was like, yeah, I didn't see how he'd get rebounds at that size. That's
yeah,
why I honestly love getting the honest interviews that are very like not hindsight because with the Giannis book, I definitely had people and teams being like, yeah, he was in our draft room. He was on our draft board. And it's like, no, he wasn't.
yeah.
He wasn't. So I just hate this like, pretending in draft stories, but to the Bulls' credit, they don't pretend.
Yeah. I'm sure you'd probably get a similar response if you ask people about like Jokic. It's like, oh no,
Right.
we definitely had, he was on our radar, but he got picked right before us. It's like, nah, I doubt you knew much about this random guy who loves horses from
Right.
from Serbia who got
No.
picked during a Taco Bell commercial. Like, I don't.
And also, wouldn't they want this better story of not knowing? That's what I don't understand about all this
Right,
hindsight, because it is so much a better story the way it actually is in real life.
right, absolutely. So when we look at Olajuwon's NBA career, without going into maybe specific games or stats, I just want
Mhm.
to take a 30,000 foot view and tie it back to religion, which we
Mhm.
discussed earlier on, and this arc that Olajuwon goes with Islam. And so you mentioned, and we talked about how important Islam was to him growing up. And then he had this like weird period of maybe about 8 to 10 years where he kind of lost himself and lost connection with religion. So what happens in between there, and then how does he ultimately come back to Islam?
Yeah, a lot of people, we were talking about generational gaps of knowledge, younger people don't really know that he, had such a temper on the court and he would get ejected from games a lot. And he was known as this fiery player that was like really hard to play with. And even though he didn't start fights, like people, I got so many people, including the really physical Sonics, to admit that they would hack him purposefully because they couldn't stop him. He would respond to the hacking, but then he would be the one that got in trouble. So that went on for, 5, 6, 7 years. And the Rockets had, some drug issues. They had Ralph Sampson's injuries. He was traded. Suddenly, this group that had gone to the '86 finals against the Celtics was just looking like a horrible team that would never make it to the playoffs. And Olajuwon himself had some issues off the court with the law, and he felt so he was known as one of the best players in the NBA, but he felt spiritually sort of empty, even though he had a lot of money. He was really successful. He called this period his dark years. And so he realizes through the help of kind of what we talked about, community, a lot of different people that I outline in the book, that he really needed that spiritual foundation back. And so he just returned to his roots. And after that, he began this gradual change, and he became a much more disciplined, calmer person. The ejections really went away. The Rockets started actually giving him talent around him. They hired Rudy Tomjanovich to take over as head coach. So you finally see him really blossoming and finally winning as he has this larger than life focus that it is about a higher being. It's not about money. It's not about success. It's not about being named MVP. It's what do I need to do to be squared with God? How do I live the best life and be the best role model I can? And so I think once he was really aligned with that, his game just took off even more.
And I think it affected or impacted, I should say, his leadership style as well. You talk about him being, kind of a nutcase on the court, but also as a leader. I mean, he was, he was fiery with his teammates. He would speak his mind, but a lot of times it didn't come across, maybe the way in which he attended to. So kind of his leadership style, maybe before, finding, religion again, and then after, like, how would you compare those two?
Yeah, I mean, okay, I actually really like when he said this, but if you were not playing hard, he would say, like the old one would say, you do not love the game, which is like the most old school diss ever. Like, you don't love it hard enough. Like, that to me, I actually love that. I see nothing wrong with that. But, take that type of, you're not doing this, or the kind of intense language to, a more calmer approach. He would take people aside. He was like a big brother to a lot of people. I mean, Scott Brooks was one of the best interviews in the book, and the way he talked about how Olajuwon took him under his wing as this like barely walk on the team was really beautiful to see. Olajuwon became like a mentor to everyone, whether it was like helping you pick out your dress suit for a game, or helping you with your rebounding. Like, he just became so much easier to talk to. He went from somebody that had this reputation of being difficult to play with to just being a really kind-hearted, funny, he's so funny guy that was like beloved.
Yeah, it was fun. There was one part in the book where, and I I honestly, from this book, really grew to love Hakeem. You mentioned, him saying, if you're not trying hard enough, you don't love the game. It kind of reminds me of, the late great Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan, any fierce competitor. But I think when he first got to Houston, maybe his coach, and I'm going to butcher this and I apologize, but somebody had said, hey, Hakeem, you need to pass out of a double team. Like, there's guys wide open and you're not passing to them. He's like, why would I pass to them? They're going to miss.
The man has a point, okay? Like that. Don Chaney would be like, well, I see where he's coming from. And but I think that it's interesting that you bring this up, because when he wins the titles, there was this narrative at the time like, oh, Hakeem trusts his teammates more. He trusts them more. That's like true and not true. True in the sense of like, yes, he had to, trust them to pass out of the double team, but it was more like he had people that could make threes, right? Like Sam Cassell raining threes, Mario Ellie, like you had to have the talent to be able to trust. So I think it's more about like the roster that Rudy Tomjanovich put together and how they were able to maximize his talents more so than him kind of having this like leap of faith in teammates.
Yeah, you mentioned the name Sam Cassell, and so for those who don't know, I'm a huge Sacramento Kings fan, which has been
in the back.
it has been tough, but we listen. I'm loyal to the Kings. I always will be. I think we have a decent chance to make some noise in the West. I think we needed another ball handler, another player who could create off the dribble, and I think that's DeRozan. Our defense is.
He's one of the best players I profiled, like one of the truly nicest people I've ever come across.
And he is the mid-range king. Like he in an era where the mid-range jump shot is dead, he is the king of that shot.
Right.
But anyways, so like when you say Sam Cassell, I immediately think back to the Timberwolves, and them beating us was it the Western Conference semifinals 2004. Game 7, I think it was a big KG game, but yeah, Sam Cassell was a big part of that team, obviously towards the latter end of his career, but yeah, a lot of bad memories with Sam Cassell.
I was gonna say I may have a better memory with LA. I just
Yeah.
was that Ori with the 3-point shot? I forgot
Yes,
that.
you had to bring it up. I wasn't going to bring it up, but you
I'm
had
so
to bring
sorry.
it up.
Okay, that was part of my childhood.
Oh, it was for me too, just for the wrong reason.
I'm never gonna get invited back on this podcast.
That's it, Mirin, you're done. We were doing great.
Good. We were
I know we were doing so well. I really enjoyed the interview, and then you had to bring up probably my worst sports memory of all time. I'm also a big 49ers fan. So like the recent Super Bowl losses, especially last year's, are pretty tough. But I still think that Ori shot is. And do you know what? Do you want to know the best part?
Tell me.
I will. I will. I will go to YouTube and I will look up that play because I just love to.
Because you like pain?
I
What?
love pain, but I will. This is well. This is how crazy I am. I will look up that play and I will envision, that because I think Kobe shot that floater where it bounced off
Yeah.
and then Shaq kind of tapped it out.
Yeah.
I will watch back that play and I will think, man, if only, I think Kobe's gonna make it this time, or man, I think Vlade's gonna get the rebound. Like it's gonna be different. I swear, if I watch it enough times.
My friend, I love the optimism, the hope.
Yeah, yeah. Also, it was rigged, and I will always stand by that. That series was rigged. Go watch the YouTube videos. There's a documentary on it. It
Stop
was
it.
rigged. The NBA wanted. So I actually had someone. Not to. We'll get back to Hakeem, I promise. But now you got me fired up. So do you? So somebody. I read this somewhere, and it kind of blew my mind. So apparently, '02 was the last year of NBC's deal, TV deal with the NBA. And so what they were scared of was having a Kings Nets NBA final because that would just tank in comparison to Lakers and anybody else.
Right.
And so that's part of the huge I'm like trying to connect all the dots, but that's part of the huge conspiracy with why the refs were favoring the Lakers, especially that game 6. I mean, that's ridiculous, but that's part of the conspiracy.
I think you should write a book on this. I think there's a lot of Kings people that want this book.
I think I mean that. Listen, I will take some advice from you with already being a best-selling author, and I'm sure Hakeem's going to do amazing. And I will interview everyone, and I will write a book. And I don't know. I'm very passionate about this. Anyways, back to Hakeem. So he finds Islam again and almost finds himself again in a way. And we talked about the difference in his leadership style, just in his demeanor. All of that changes after he finds religion again. But one of the more interesting parts, for those who maybe have some Muslims in their life, I grew up in the Bay Area, so I had a lot of Muslim friends growing up. Obviously, a huge part of the religion is the month of Ramadan, and with that comes a fast that happens. And so Hakeem does this thing where he fasts during the month of Ramadan during games. Can you explain again, just maybe for those unfamiliar, what that looked like in practice, what that really looked like for Hakeem?
I mean, it's astounding. Like, he would wake up and you'd have something like oatmeal, and then you just would not eat for the rest of the day. And in that day, midday would be a playoff game. And he's dropping 40 points on an empty stomach, like just, and not even, you can't drink water. And his teammates would try to give him these little, like, mouth watering little, I forgot what they're called, little quenchers. And he was like, no, I can't have not even a drop of water. And they would tempt him, like, come on, Dream, take a sip. You're going to get so dehydrated. He was like, no, I won't. He cannot do it until the sun goes down. And because of the timing of these games, he would often have to, play through it. And that was a conscious choice that he decided to make and do after that second title. And so some of his best games were later in his career, 95, 96, 97. He's just casually like dropping 40 and 15 with nothing in his stomach, no water. But while everyone focused on how thirsty he must be and how hungry he must be, I really wanted to focus on how he felt like this made him stronger. And in the absence of food, he was spiritually replenished. He didn't have water, but he had this conviction and this faith, and it made him feel lighter and more focused. So it's kind of flipping that on the head. And again, you look through the archives. That's why I love journalism, like just seeing what, the headlines wrote of, oh, Hakeem was dying of thirst. And he was just staring at them and saying, no, I feel great. Like I feel spiritually replenished. I feel good, feel lighter. So it was just important. And there's so many people that watched his games that didn't know what Ramadan was. And so it was like educating people in real time unintentionally. And then for, many Muslim kids, as well as, especially in Houston, there was a sense of confidence that they had from seeing him and from, having it be so mainstream, and hearing him talk about Islam so openly and lovingly. It made a huge, huge impact on a generation of people.
Yeah, that was really cool to read about how many people Hakeem inspired, and not just and the reach of his inspiration. It
Hmm.
wasn't just in Houston. It wasn't just in maybe his immediate neighborhood. It was felt all over the world. And towards the end of the book, you write about players who said Hakeem is the reason I play. Or kids growing up. Hakeem is the reason that I follow basketball. Just the reach that he had and how many people he impacted was really cool to read about.
Yeah, and I think to me that's the legacy, right? How do you affect other people?
Hmm.
We all want to like live a meaningful life and, do things we're passionate about, but it's just helpful to think about, how are you helping other people? And I think to me with him, he's such a giver, and I think the fact that his story has been so lost to time is really sad. And I do want people to know how great at basketball he was, but I more so want people to understand the way that he was so significant culturally to so many different communities. I think that's like the most important part of the book.
And kind of maybe a dichotomy that comes up is, and maybe this is obviously we're looking back on time and we realize how amazing Hakeem was, but again against the backdrop of what he was dealing with, not only his community but in a broader sense within the NBA community, within the United States, he was a player that many described as hard to market. And so while other NBA players had these shoe deals and they were in these commercials and had all of these endorsements, Hakeem didn't really have that. Do you have an explanation for why that might have been?
Well, I spent a whole chapter on this because it really, honestly, I hate to bring it up again, but it gives me so many echoes of Giannis of, oh, his name is too hard to pronounce. Oh, he's not marketable, which is crazy. He's like the most marketable person ever. Hakeem was like that too. And there was this one editorial in the New York Times that was just insane. They basically said that, advertisers prefer, quote, an American guy. They feel there's a stigma, his name, Nigeria. And so, he dealt with a lot of, covert and overt type of, dog whistles like that throughout his career. And, it made me really sad, but it also made me respect his foray into sneakers even more because his were $35 or something like that when the average one was 120 at the time, and people made fun of his sneakers, and they really said he wasn't capable of selling shoes or being marketable, but he was like, why can't I just be a good person and be a good example? How is that not marketable? So I think that um he it really it you would think some of these articles were written in 2024, sadly.
Yeah. Yeah, and honestly, I'm glad you brought that up because I had almost the same reaction. Like if you like there's certain parts of the book, to your point, you bring up certain articles or certain things that were said, and without you specifying, hey, this was said back then, it's not hard to imagine that some of these things are still said today. And it was interesting too because like at the time, obviously you had MJ, Shaq was coming into his own towards the latter end of Hakeem's career. You had all these bigger than life personalities, and Hakeem was like almost the exact polar opposite,
Mhm.
where he was just like, my goal is to please God. If I give it my all, that's what I'm happy with. The rest is kind of in God's hands. If He wants me to win, I'll win.
Mhm.
And then again, you had MJ. I even look at Barkley. It's top of mind after finishing the book and then interviewing Tim Bella. But Barkley, who was like always in the news and he was always saying something crazy, and he was spitting on fans during a game, and just like the most crazy stories. But for a company that was marketable to them, like that bigger than life personality.
It's sad. It really is sad to me. I mean, there's one quote that you just made me think of. This people asked him after his 1995 championship, are you the best player in the game? Who's the best player in the game? And he basically said something along the lines of, I don't think like that. I like myself. I like my game. I love playing. If that is not a role model, if that is not marketable, then I don't know what is. In a way, you see Giannis's conversation about failure, that they have so many similar vibes, and I think now people are starting to come around and see how marketable Giannis is. But yeah, those lessons at the time, again, I think it's Hakeem flew under the radar even in his prime, right? Like
Yeah.
he just won two championships, and the New York Times is saying that they prefer, like, advertisers prefer an American guy. He really just won back-to-back championships as the best player in the whole world, and he's not marketable. Um, I mean, can you imagine how underrated Hakeem is these days if even in his prime that potential wasn't recognized?
Yeah. I mean, he is, again, as someone who follows basketball, who's a huge fan. Um, you hear the name, but you don't really understand how special he was. And
Right.
so maybe that brings me to this point, which is, can you help us understand? And I'm sure people will as they read the book, but just how great Hakeem was, and maybe there's certain stats that jump out, or maybe certain accomplishments, but just help us kind of frame how special Hakeem was as a basketball player.
He's near 7 feet tall and he remains top 10 in steals. Like, that is, picture a really, really tall guy getting steals at the rate of these guards that are, I don't know how else that is crazy. That is impossible. That should never happen. He was different. I know it's, oh, he's different. But really, he really was different. You have to understand that, like, he made people like David Robinson, like the best people that were the best in the game, look silly. I mean, he just embarrassed and demolished these people, oftentimes without drinking food and water. Hakeem was something else. I'll say this, I interviewed 266 people for this book. Every single time I got on the phone with somebody, they would be like, "Oh my God, Hakeem was just," the way they talk about him. It's you just, there's never anything bad they had to say about him. And that is so rare to have, like, unanimous, just admiration and respect.
Yeah. As we wrap up this interview, we want to be cognizant of your time. I There's one person that comes to mind. It's towards the latter end of the book, I think what this person said really summarizes how dominant Hakeem was, and that person is Shaq. They obviously played against each other in the '95 NBA Finals. What was Shaq's response to playing against Hakeem?
I loved interviewing Shaq. To be expected, a great interview. He was the one person that I couldn't intimidate. Shaq would really, he was like, Hakeem just, he was not fazed by me. And he said, because he was so respectful of Hakeem, he admired him so much. He was like, I gave him a little too much respect in that Magic series. And the two of them became close. They shared an agent in Leonard Armato. But Shaq, he once, growing up, he snuck into the Alamo Dome, I think it was called, and he got Olajuwon's signature when he was 16. So he has always loved Olajuwon, and Shaq is Muslim as well. So they connected on a deeper level. A lot of people don't know that as well. Shaq was just like, he ranked I didn't ask him to rank his top five because I don't like doing that. And you write a whole thoughtful book and then the only thing that gets pulled is the quote about the top five, but here is sports media. But Shaq himself said he would put Olajuwon ahead of him, which was kind.
Yeah, that's that's sorry. So not to get off topic again, but that point about the top five is so funny.
And when people do it to me, I'm like, I'm the wrong person for this. This is not what I write about.
Yeah, can you list your top five NBA players ever? Just I was just hoping to post a clip on social media and go viral. So if you could just do that, that would be great.
Yeah, not falling for it. Not falling for it. I'll tell you, look who Barack Obama put in his top five. Did you see that
I,
clip?
you know what's so funny? I saw that after reading your book. I
Hmm.
s- and you know what? If I hadn't, I'm telling you this with sincere honesty. If I hadn't read your book, I would be like, why is Hakeem
Hmm.
why is Hakeem top five?
Here's my question. How do we get Obama my book? I shot my shot on Twitter.
Mm,
I literally wrote, "Hey, Barack Obama, I just did this book." There you go. God knows if he'll ever see it, but at least somebody has a good starting five.
yeah, yeah. Well, if I can help in any way, I certainly will. But yeah, I listen. I'll tweet at Obama. I don't care. I'll shoot my shot.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, again, it's so funny how that worked out because after reading your book, I'm like, dang, Hakeem, if Shaq is saying Hakeem's better than him, I respect that. I mean, he played against him, right? David Robinson too. I mean, you write about Hakeem playing against Robinson, and David Robinson was like, I don't know what to do with him. Like, I don't know,
Yeah.
right? So, anyways, the takeaways from this podcast is that Barack Obama knows ball, and that
100%.
and that Hakeem Olajuwon is criminally underrated. Um, Before we end, just in general, those Houston teams, when I think about teams that went back to back, Houston somehow, the 94 and the 95 championships, we talk about Hakeem as being criminally underrated. Those Houston teams also seem to be criminally underrated. Rarely, at least in the circles that I follow, do they get brought up as an all-time team, or they often get overlooked. Besides maybe, again, Hakeem pulling much of that weight in terms of being underrated, why do you think Houston often gets overlooked even though they won back-to-back titles?
I mean, people want to point out, Jordan's retirement and the
Mm,
timing of that, but also it's just it wasn't a team. It was not a superstar team. Like they had amazing players like Clyde Drexler and, you know, Kenny Smith, like a lot of great players, but nobody would pick that team and say, wow, that's one of the super teams of all time. I think the brilliance of that team was how great they were when they were not the most talented. They did not have the best record. They fought back when they were down. I mean, it was the most resilient group, if not the most, talented group. And I think because of that, they get overlooked.
yeah, and why do you think Barkley and Hakeem didn't work out? I mean, I guess you could maybe alter your definition of what working out means, but ultimately Barkley wanted to win a ring, and they couldn't get it done.
I think also, like, you have to keep in mind that Hakeem, his body was on its way, sort of breaking down by that point. Like, I don't think Barkley got the best version of Hakeem. Um, I wondered what they could have been like had they teamed up earlier, but that era was when Hakeem really started experiencing different issues, different injuries, and bodies started to kind of be on the, you know, going down a little bit. Um, but I Barkley has great respect for Olajuwon, great respect, and it's funny that he too was what do you call it, mentored by Moses Malone. So I think they always shared that and respected that about each other. It just didn't work out.
Yeah. Miran, as we wrap up this podcast, and the life of Hakeem, if you've made it to this point, hopefully I did not need to convince you to go buy the book. Again, it comes out October 15th. Anywhere where you can get books, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere that sells books. Highly recommend. We obviously covered some ground with Hakeem, but if you want all the details, all the quotes, all the stories, all the in between, I highly recommend you go pick up the book because it is a great read. And it is a very important book, not only because Barack Obama picked Hakeem as his center in his all-time starting lineup, but because it sheds light on one of the most underrated basketball players of all time and one of the most overlooked people of all time, most influential people of all time. And Mirin, maybe we'll end it with this. One of the more impactful stories, again, is towards the latter end of your book, and it talks about Hakeem's role post 9/11. And that really stood out to me. I mean, I was pretty young when 9/11 happened, and um, I was young to overlook maybe a lot of the repercussions from 9/11, especially within the Muslim community. Can you talk a little bit about what Hakeem's role was within the Muslim community, and just the voice that he had?
Yeah, he was critical. I mean, he was somebody so he had just gotten traded to Toronto. And like in America, Muslims in Ontario were also subjected to the same kind of discrimination, Islamophobia. I mean, mosques were set on fire, just a horrific time of bigotry. And Olajuwon did all of these things behind the scenes to be there for his community, whether it's helping fund mosques that could not get money because banks were hesitant to work with Muslims, as some of the people in the Toronto Muslim community told me, and whether it's helping students at nearby universities find a prayer room. He was just very present. He spoke to a lot of different Muslim audiences throughout that time. You know, people think of the Toronto year as almost like a failure in his career because it was this weird 1 year and then he retires. The Raptors were terrible. He had injuries and a down year, but you know, it may not have been productive on the court, but off the court, he played a pivotal role.
Yeah. As you, obviously, I would argue you are probably the most knowledgeable person on Hakeem Olajuwon, besides perhaps Hakeem himself or maybe his immediate family. But the amount of research that you did, you know, you mentioned you interviewed 266 people. One of the questions that I love to ask when I interview authors is just the amount of work that went into writing a book, because I think it gives readers an appreciation for how much effort it takes to put something like this together. So as we wrap up, can you just touch on the effort that it took to put this thing together?
Oh my God, it was so hard. Man, and I have my day job at The Ringer where I'm covering the NBA and writing features, so it's kind of like juggling two jobs at once. But you know, it was just so much effort. 266 interviews. I mean, I must have reached out to 400 people, so there's a lot of L's taken there, and a lot of different drafts of the book. You know, writing is rewriting. I wrote this book several different ways. It was so hard, but it was so rewarding. Like I truly admire this person. You know, the work is important. I think, unfortunately, I mean, this is going to take a morbid tone, but unfortunately, a lot of people that I interviewed have passed away since I talked with them. And it's just reminded me that this work is so important. There are so many NBA legends that we're losing. So I don't know, I felt an urgency during this project. Like, I got to get this done. I want to get this out. But it's also given me motivation of like, in the future, I still want to cover legends, and I hope to get these stories.
Well, that's exciting for me because it sounds like Hakeem will not be your last book. And as a fan of your work, not looking to put words in your mouth, but I hope that there's many other books that come to follow because you know, so far you're 2 for 2. So
Thank you so much.
Mirin, one last question. I promise we'll let you go. What just Hakeem's life, him as a person, what's like your main takeaway? Just to end it with like an overall takeaway from Hakeem.
You can be really, really successful and be true to yourself. He didn't have to lose his values and religion and sacrifice that for being a world-class athlete. He didn't care that he wasn't popular or marketable or whatever, all these things. He was true to himself, his religion, and I think that's really cool. I think that's really cool. We don't talk enough about like authenticity. I think everyone thinks they're authentic. Everyone thinks they're, unique, but like being authentic is like being okay with yourself, regardless if people see it or don't see it. I love that he gives without praise. Like all the things I talked about that he did behind the scenes, there aren't press releases for them. You would never know the stories of how he helped those mosques. He does it because it's the right thing to do, not because he wants praise. So I just think that's just something we all can learn from. Like just do the work.
Well said. Mirin Fader, everyone, best-selling author, soon to be 2-time best-selling author. Mirin, where can people find you and find more of your work?
Oh my gosh, thank you for spending so much time with me. People can find me, I hate calling it X. I'm on X at Mirin Fader, and also Instagram, which I like way better, and Substack. So yeah, thank you again.
Thank you, Mirin. This has been fantastic. Love that we were able to chat about Hakeem and his life and legacy. Again, pick up The Dream, The Life and Legacy of Hakeem Olajuwon anywhere you find books. Out tomorrow, Tuesday, October 15th. Mirin, thanks again.
Thank you.